I think I'm going to go ahead and start, and people can wander in if they.
Thank you for waiting.
My name is Shelley. I'm sure you all know that by now. Thanks so much for coming today. It's an honor and a privilege to share my work with you on this Central High School reunion weekend. And it makes me particularly happy that my brother Bob, class of 1970, and his partner Susan, my videographer, are here from Laramie, Wyoming. We can blame this cold weather event on them. Susan is responsible for enhancing the resolution of the photographs in the book and for assisting me with the tedium of copy editing. Bob, other family members, and former classmates, some of whom are here today, graciously lent their own reflections and memories to my story, which was made better by the depth and nuance of their contributions. Don Jones' company, Alchemy Media Publishing, oversaw this book's evolution from its earliest inception as a rough outline. I owe Don and many others a debt of gratitude for helping me get it over the finish line. I'll begin my presentation with a quote from L.R. Nost. Tell your story, shout it, write it, whisper it if you have to, but tell it. Some won't understand it, some will outright reject it, but many will thank you for it. Unquote. Over the course of 2 years, I sat at the same table on the third floor of this building and wrote. It's become very clear to me that this book could only have been written in Memphis, which I once again call home. My connection to the Benjamin Hooks Library is layered and deeply personal, as Ben's wife, Frances Hooks, was a mentor and second mother to me in my junior high and high school years. Through a Blue-Eyed Lens is a select memoir that details my coming of age in this city during the decade that spanned 1962 to 1972. My personal narrative is set against the backdrop of public school desegregation in an increasingly troubled city. As most of us in this room remember, 1968 is the year that Memphis became the vortex of the civil rights movement, when a labor strike and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought the city to its knees. 55 years ago this fall, the essence of this memoir came in the form of a note. Its shocking words admitting a teenage crush that in 1967 seemed impossible to fathom. A 13-year-old black student, Dwayne Kiles, asked me, a 13-year-old white student, to be his girlfriend. Our decision to date across racial lines was illicit and ill-advised. One thing is certain, without the advent of that teenage crush, I would not have written this book. As is true for us all, there would have been a storyline to my life, but given my environment at the time, odds are I would have remained a sheltered white girl who would have had little reason to question or challenge the prevailing status quo between the white and black communities. As fate would have it, the audacity and charm of that courageous invitation into Dwayne's world changed my life and my perspective and informed the person I am today. James Baldwin said, quote, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us and are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. History is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." Unquote. History is a composite of personal stories. Where we find ourselves today is a direct result of individual and collective action and inaction, decision, and indecision. I think the reader will, in many ways, find the subject matter of my book relevant and timeless, and just may recognize some disquieting similarities between the past and today. There's a lot going on in this book. My intention this afternoon is to inspire curiosity without spoiling the read, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and reflections after I share bits of the narrative. Copies of my book are available for purchase and signing after the reading. Leonard Cohen said, "Music is the emotional life of most people." Alex Gaskarth said, "Music is the soundtrack to every good and bad time we will ever have." Music has always provided important theater to life. No matter the genre, it tends to walk right in and take up residence in the nooks and crannies of memory banks, causing reflexive responses to songs and compositions. Associated with people and events in our lives, opening riffs and familiar refrains can bring smiles to our faces or tears to our eyes. Because songs and artists from the 60s and 70s reflect so many of our collective experiences, I reference that music in my headings. Hopefully, some of my choices strike a chord or awaken a memory for you. In writing this book, it would have been much safer and simpler for me to make claims backed up by data and dates. But statistics and numbers don't begin to explain what took place in Memphis during the decade that spanned 1962 to 1972. In bookending those years, I've tried to be transparent, even vulnerable, as I set loose bits of that history and transpose mere fact into substantive and emotional content. The 1960s and 1970s witnessed a Memphis moment, an instance illustrated by unique relationships, interactions, and events. I was here by a twist of fate, not by choice. My part in that chapter of history is but a microscopic blip, its only significance being the interconnectedness of people, place, and time. Some will recognize themselves or others in these stories. People who through luck, common cause, serendipity, or sheer coincidence crossed paths during that decade in Memphis, Tennessee. I don't know how it feels to be anything other than a white woman. I grew up a privileged white girl in an extremely segregated and racist environment. I feel so very fortunate to have spent 10 of my most formative years in Memphis, where I was confronted with choices about how to respond to that landscape. I was faced with options about how to address people, how to refer to people, how to shape my world, and who to include in that sphere. I ended up making different choices than most of my white peers. Not necessarily better, different. Because of those decisions, I learned at an early age how it feels to cross lines, to challenge perceptions and assumptions, to make wildly unpopular decisions, and to face unsettling and unpredictable consequences. Even though we left Wyoming before I turned 2, my family roots run deep in Laramie and the nearby mountains, where as a kid I spent part of each summer. Memphis, on the other hand, saw me through 10 significant years. When I left in 1972, I now understand that I was effectively running away from a lot of heartache and conflict. Once again, calling Memphis home has allowed me to face some of that angst and to forge a new reality in a city that is, even with its considerable growth and development, deeply and wonderfully familiar. The This is an anonymous quote. I wish I knew who said it, but I don't. As a woman in the South at that time, you either had a maid or you were one. Let that sink in for a minute. I think that's a powerful quote. I'll preface this next piece with the fact that I use several voices in this book, and one of the options that I chose was to write figurative letters that told part of the story without just, stating the facts, ma'am. I wanted to present it in a different format, just to mix things up a little bit. So this is a letter that I constructed about an actual relationship with actual interactions and conversations and experiences I had with this woman. Dear Maddie, you are the first black woman I've ever known. In pristine white uniforms and worn shoes, you work in a house across the street from us. 5 long days a week, riding a series of city buses to and from work, you leave your own children in the care of your mother. I know that you're never picked up or dropped off at your house, but sometimes when it's raining, the lady you work for fetches you from the bus stop. Every time I watch you climb into or out of the back seat of her car. Always the back seat. You have dedicated your waking hours to the well-being of that white family, and I'll bet they don't even know your kids' names or where you live. At day's end, you wearily trudge back to the bus stop to begin your long journey home, to take care of your own. I can tell that you really love the 4 kids in that house across the street. They're your babies. You've raised them like your own, and they know you're in charge when your mom is not around. When they're naughty, you tell them, go outside and get me a switch. You're fixing to get a licking. I kind of don't get this whole situation, but I know better than to get crossways with you. I'm sorry you have to leave your young kids at home, and I don't understand why you have to work so hard for so little pay. Why don't those people do their own housework and punish their own children? Still, I'm really glad that I get to see you most days. One day I think I'll appreciate my front row seat in all of this and understand what I was witnessing. When I'm older, I'll surely have a different perspective on the age-old intersection of Black lives and white privilege. My stacks up. The distinct and pervasive racial divide that our family witnessed as we settled into life in Memphis was a sobering introduction to what centuries of slavery had wrought in the Deep South. In the sense that we represented a young professional white family, we appeared to conform. But actually, the clearly defined, well-established, and strongly defended lifestyles and norms of the Deep South were antithetical to who my parents were and how they chose to live. I should say our, because my brother's here. How and why our parents organically evolved into liberally progressive people remains a question that will probably never be satisfactorily answered. They claim that there was no intellectual or academic exercise involved in the evolution of their socio-political beliefs and related lifestyle. It's simply who they were and how they raised their children. There was no family mission statement about who we would welcome into our lives and into our home. We kids understood and were witness to the fact that our door was open to everyone, regardless of race, nationality, religious belief, sexual orientation, or political leaning. That was a big deal in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1960s. September of 1962 saw my siblings and me enrolled at Idlewild Elementary School. Established in 1903 and still ranked as one of Memphis's finest schools, Idlewild remains a Midtown institution a looming brick structure with a commanding presence on an otherwise quiet residential street. School buildings back in the day weren't air-conditioned. When classes commenced in September, we endured lingering heat and humidity, making third-floor classrooms especially unbearable. Come fall, radiators were turned on for the duration of winter months, bringing their own steamy oppression to our interminably long school days until we could once again welcome springtime and the promise of summer vacation. There are 3 black students in our 1965 combined class photo of 82 5th and 6th graders at Idlewild. At that time, it didn't occur to me to have an opinion on the subject of school desegregation. Kids were kids. I now understand that those first black kids at Idlewild weren't afforded the luxury of such indifference. What I didn't know as well is that they were but 3 of a number of young black children in Memphis who, for the first time in their lives, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a veritable sea of white people. Some of us white students were simply unmindful of the significance of black kids in our classrooms. Others' responses weren't quite as innocuous. If you, as a white reader, don't think this was a big deal, flip the script and put yourself in the black student's position for 1 minute. Mandatory school desegregation had, on paper, been the law of the land since the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. But as was the case with the city of Memphis swimming pools, the local Board of Education found ways to avoid and delay full compliance with the law. In order to mollify government mandates, the board crafted the low-bar definition of quote-unquote integration as any school with 1 enrolled minority student. Let me reiterate, the Memphis School Board deemed that the presence of 1 black student in an otherwise white student body constituted an integrated school. For the most part, black and white kids in the South had never spent time together, anywhere, in any context, under any circumstance. We may have passed each other on downtown sidewalks or in grocery stores as we shopped with our moms, but contemplating the shared spaces of hallways, bathrooms, classrooms, locker rooms, playgrounds, and cafeterias at Bellevue was an altogether new dimension. Those uncomfortable with the emergence of school desegregation must have felt like they were walking onto a minefield. Within the walls of majority white schools, black and white students were now part of a grand experiment, ostensibly to begin to right the wrongs of so many years of separate and unequal. In boardrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms, adults made the decisions and dictated the terms. We children became pawns in a brand new game, being asked to do that which most adults, in their own professional and personal lives, found incomprehensible. The onus was on us as young people to make this groundbreaking clinical trial succeed. Many of us here today lived through, in fact embodied, the transition to desegregated schools. We witnessed the good, the bad, and the ugly of that march, however imperfect, toward greater equality. We were given a tremendous opportunity to expand our horizons in ways that went far beyond lessons in the classroom. Though not always pretty or comfortable years, for those of us open to new possibilities, they were critically important chapters in our adolescent development. The experience of being quote-unquote other can be fairly commonplace for people of color. Most of us white folk have never been the lone Caucasian in a conference room, swimming pool, or department store. at a bar, in a classroom, or at a party. Accustomed to, comfortable with, and smug in our majority status, we assume that the space we inhabit and how we occupy and define it is the norm. Even if unaware of doing so, we expect others to adapt, to figure out how to conform to our circumscribed world. The vast majority of friendships that did develop between black and white kids began and ended within the halls and on the playing fields of the school grounds. We were managing ourselves as a desegregated body. But there was little actual integration taking place as we took comfort in the safe harbor of our cliques and returned to our own worlds at the end of each school day. The very idea of reaching those racial boundaries on a broader social basis didn't enter most people's minds, most students' minds. Messing around with new friends at school within the parameters of sports or chorus was one thing. Inviting those friendships into the personal confines of home, family, and neighborhood, quite another. Ultimately, very few of us black and white students at Bellevue walked through each other's doors, shared meals, or slept in each other's homes. We seldom met each other's parents or siblings, nor did we see movies together or swim in the same pool. There was no opportunity to dance with each other. The very concept of dating someone of another race was inconceivable. In 1967, Hollywood released two groundbreaking movies, both starring Sidney Poitier. To Sir with Love and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner brought interracial crushes and relationships to the big screen, exploding conventional mores of the film industry. 1967 also brought sweeping, monumental changes to my personal life, a critical turning point that I never could have imagined. My life changed forever when that cinematic representation of black and white romance came true for me. I don't know when Dwayne informed his parents of his decision to date a white girl, but there was no way that this relationship would go unnoticed by anyone. Even though we kept our relationship on the down low as much as possible, containing our excitement wasn't easy. Too young to drive and too smart to flaunt, we spent our time together outside of school in each other's homes or friends' homes. On weekend nights, we went to parties, a lot of parties. With lights down as low as host parents would allow, we and our friends danced to a revolving selection of Motown, Atlantic, and Stax 45s. What were we thinking? Well, quite honestly, we weren't. We were young, buoyed by naivete, audacity, and foolishness. The difference, and we knew it, was that there were inquisitive eyes and dark clouds casting a pall over us wherever we went. Yet, like most teens who believe they are impervious to danger, we couldn't begin to imagine the very real threats that lurked, or a vulnerability that went far beyond rude stares and denigrating verbiage. From our limited youthful perspective, bad things only happened out there somewhere to other people, or on the big screen. But this wasn't Hollywood, and it wasn't make-believe. To my girlfriends, this is another figurative letter that I wrote to my girlfriend at the time. For reasons that I can't totally comprehend, you have welcomed this pale girl into your circle. I have had the pleasure of meeting your families and on occasion sharing meals and joining slumber parties in your homes. In our world, this is unprecedented. I am your first white friend, and you are my first black girlfriends. A door was opened wide for all of us when Dwayne and I began dating. You didn't have to invite me in, but you did. I look at magazine covers and models, mannequins and actors, cartoon and book characters, and I see myself, my world, all white. Except for the jet and ebony issues that you've introduced me to, and the rare sighting of a black actor on TV or a movie screen, you see somebody else's world, all white. So few literary or commercial images that you can relate to or connect with. So few that reflect who you are. As junior high students, my black friends and I sometimes attended each other's churches. I was always welcomed by their congregations, but the folks at my church weren't terribly excited about seeing black visitors walk through the door. It didn't take long for me to learn the hard lesson that not even the pledges of Christianity could ease or honestly address the persistent sting of racism and segregation. During the winter of 1968, an unspeakable tragedy occurred. In a desperate attempt to escape pounding rainstorms on a cold and wet February day, two workers, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, climbed into the back of their assigned garbage truck. They were crushed to death when the vehicle's mechanical system short-circuited and activated the hydraulic ram, pulling the two men into the garbage-filled cavity of the truck. As a direct result of these catastrophic and wholly preventable deaths, and despite the fact that the city charter forbade employee strikes, several hundred beleaguered and grieving sanitation workers walked off the job. Their demands included improved working conditions, a pay increase schedule, and the right to organize for benefits. This group of men who risked everything in their decision to walk off the job was sustained by churches and community groups. Supporters raised funds to feed, provide transportation, and pay rent and house notes for the workers and their families for the duration of the strike. After serving as planning director for 6 years, my father, Jerry, accepted the appointment as chief administrative officer under Mayor Henry Lowe, and he was sworn into that position in January of 1968. As local newspapers confirmed, Lowe chose Jerry based on his steady manner and his impressive accomplishments as planning director. Though they were both registered Democrats, my dad and Henry Lowe represented polar opposites of the social and political spectrum. Well aware of that dichotomy, the two men agreed to leave their differences at the door while working inside City Hall. I and many others have questioned how my father reconciled working directly under a man who was an avowed segregationist and obstructionist. Even after numerous conversations through the years with my dad on the subject, I can't offer a plausible explanation for that unlikely pairing. What does make sense to me is this. My father wasn't hired to be a Loeb loyalist. He was hired to work for the people of Memphis. He had a job to do, and as a dedicated public servant, he made sure he did it well. It may be as simple as that. In February of 1968, Mayor Lowe found himself underwater, consumed by the strike. Just after my dad assumed the role of CAO, Lowe directed him, my father, just shy of his 34th birthday, to take the reins of all city departments until the mayor could regain control of his city. A city that was quickly unraveling amidst the divisiveness of the labor strike. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues were busy organizing a massive Poor People's March on Washington, slated for later that summer. But because the sanitation strike was seen as emblematic of so much suffering and injustice in the American Black community, Dr. King was asked to lend his name and his support to the effort. A march was planned and executed. When that event was cut short by violent confrontations between police and marchers, a frustrated and disappointed Dr. King flew home to Atlanta. With no new contract for the striking workers in sight, and with a renewed commitment to nonviolence by local leaders, Dr. King agreed to return to Memphis on April 3rd. A second march was set for April 5th. In rooms of the Black-owned Lorraine Motel, colleagues gathered to strategize details for the upcoming march. Everyone involved desperately needed this protest to remain peaceful and purposeful. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was preparing to leave the Lorraine Motel with Reverend Kyles, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, and others for dinner in the Kyles home. Dwayne's mom and a crew of church women had spent the day cooking and baking. Men from the church had arranged tables and chairs for the anticipated meal. With places set and food prepared, the host family and church members eagerly awaited the men's arrival. The group of men would not enter the Kyles house until very late that night, and Dr. King would not be among the guests. When friends and colleagues finally gathered to break bread, I am told that the house was filled with a quiet rage and deep sorrow. With special dispensation from the city, Coretta Scott King flew to Memphis from Atlanta. On April 8th, only 4 days after her husband was senselessly murdered, she led a march of 42,000 silent and reverent mourners. At just 13, I will never forget being part of that grieving mass of humanity, a collage of age, color, and orientation that flowed through the downtown streets of Memphis like a river of tears. Dwayne, you and I weren't afforded the luxury of a simple teenage crush. Our decision to date each other thrust us unwittingly into an adult realm of complication and concern. We never even had the heady freedom of walking down the street hand in hand, or of attending a school dance together. Our affection for one another immediately became a problem, a liability, a personal danger. In this charged environment, we didn't stand a chance. Attending Memphis schools ended up being for me the best of times and the worst of times. However, without qualification or hesitation, I would not trade those years for anything. In the spring of 1972, while my classmates, several of whom are here, were preparing for graduation, most looking ahead to college, I nailed the GED and set off on a lifelong journey of empirical learning and entrepreneurial exploits. Higher education for me came in the form of life itself. As Mary J. Blige sings, "It's a wrap." By 1972, the city was officially in my family's collective rearview mirror. Memphis was never expected to be on our radar in the first place. My father's career could have taken us anywhere: Boise, Petaluma, Bangor, Sarasota. But the call came from Memphis. That decade proved to be our family's longest stint together in any one place. As individuals and as a family, we had plenty of good times. I can't sugarcoat it though. The 1960s took a toll on us. Not always on the same page, we sometimes didn't approve of or support each other's decisions. At times, the Moore family presented a unified body. and at other times we stood our ground as individuals. But the one common thing we gleaned from our time in Memphis was an irrefutable deviation in our destinies, and as a result, in our perspectives. Just like the I-40 expressway design that saved Overton Park, our lives have been rerouted and redirected. And so a story that began with my parents now takes leave with a nod to them. Without being precisely who they were while I was growing up, these pages would have read very differently. Their equanimity allowed me to dance and stumble my way through good times and bad as I came of age in Memphis. My parents were not always unequivocally supportive of my decisions, but for the most part, they allowed me to own my failures as well as my successes. Readers have wanted to know where life took me after I left Memphis. I have no intention of detailing those decades, but I will say this. For those familiar with G's Bend quilts, you'll understand the metaphor of my life as a patchwork assemblage awash with color and texture, designed and constructed with precious few straight lines or right angles. The very best of those years are evident in the lives of my sons and their families. So dry your eyes, compose yourselves.
I have a question. How long were you gone from Memphis before you decided to come back?
Almost 40 years. Yeah, and I never even thought about visiting Memphis again. It just didn't occur to me.
40 years.
Yeah. My older brother wanted to come down to Clarksdale to go to the Juke Joint Festival. Somebody has the Juke Joint Festival. And so Susan and Bob and our mom and I, we traveled to Memphis, and we flew in and out of Memphis, of course, and ate barbecue, of course, and went to Clarksdale, and it was just and as Oprah would say, an aha moment for me. It was a moment in which I realized that this was my home and that I wanted to live here again. So it took me 6 years after I was here for that trip to move back. Yeah. 1972 I left, 2011 I came back. A lifetime. Yeah.
Oh, we're glad you came back.
I'm so happy I came back, I love it.
I tell people that all the time, Shelley, that growing up here and growing up when we did it and where we did it and how we did it, there's something about Memphis I can never let go of, even though I never have moved back.
Yeah.
It's, taken my wife Lee the last few days and driven her around town. Ironically, my childhood best friend lives across the street from where we went to elementary school. And just I'm flooded with memories, and like you say, some are beyond cherishable. They will be there long after I'm gone, and others that are painful, but still help me be who I am today.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I hear that a lot, and I feel that a lot. And I think everybody, when they go back to their childhood home, whether it's a town or a city or a farm or whatever, it's a going home moment. And it brings back so many memories, and some good, some not so good. But Memphis, at the time we grew up here, was its own universe, and there's nothing to compare it to.
It was magic. It wasn't always dark magic or white magic.
Right.
It was a magical place because we may have been at the crux. I mean, so much that came to pass after Martin's assassination is because of what happened to those weeks leading up.
Yeah.
That your dad was intimately involved in.
Right.
And that by the time we graduated from high school, we could see Memphis having changed forever, even though many things remain the same.
Right. Yeah.
Many changes.
Yeah.
Can you share some of the emotions you felt as you were
writing the book, and did you think you could finish it? You really just determined to finish it, or was it something?
Did I believe I could finish it? Is that what you're asking?
And what kind of emotions, feeling, as you were writing?
I didn't believe I could start it, much less finish it. So it was interesting. Don and Andrea came to Laramie, and I had written what I thought was, pretty darn good, at least beginning of the book. And Don said, "Well, that's a good outline." And I was like, "Oh dear, what am I up against here?" So 2 years ago, it was a seedling that just grew in my mind and my heart, and I started coming to this building every 5 days a week and sat at the same table and just wrote and wrote and wrote.
One of the best devices I think you incorporated were those reflective letters, those imagined letters, because it really offered a perspective and a window into, what you were feeling. The best writing is always about what you felt in the moment, as opposed to that said repertorial, this happened, So that's really, I'd like to commend you for that, because that's to me, that's really the most insightful part of the management.
Yeah, I'm happy with that for the moment.
Very, very.
Being able to express what you not only saw and lived through, as opposed to going back to the commercial appeal, and let's go back through those years.
But the perspective of these,
Yes.
40 years,
Right.
you're very good.
It's interesting, people ask me how many diaries and journals I kept. None. I didn't keep diaries and journals, but I remember, I said during a recent interview that some of the actual wording that I used in the book may be a little off from what actually happened that day or, in that moment, but the story is very accurate. Very accurate.
That comes
And,
across.
pardon?
That comes across. It feels real.
Good. Yeah. So, because I've carried this story around with me, it's a pretty potent story. Because I was an impressionable child when most of this happened, and
I think
it stuck with me. So anyway, I didn't believe I could finish the book until I finished the book, Aurelia. It took me a good year and a half working on it.
Keep saying this, but I think you ought to do an audio version,
I can't hear.
an audio book.
Oh, yeah, right,
It
right,
comes across so well as you're reading it.
right. I would love to do that. What complicates that a little bit is not only the expense of an audiobook, but also there's so many voices in the book, and that was intentional on my part. I have male and female, I have black and white, I have older and younger, and there's no way, I can't quite imagine one person, myself or anybody else, reading all of those voices and doing them justice. So that's something that I have to think about. I think it would require several readers to make it legitimate, but I'm not there. I'm not even close to doing an audio book. I'm just thinking about it. But I think you're right. I think it would be really compelling.
I'm for it.
Pardon?
I would love to have an audiobook.
You know something about a listener that's listening to an audiobook. For example, I listen to a book by Dorwell, and all the children, men, women, different races. But as a listener, even though it was Eudora's voice, the way it was written and the way she read the phrasing, I was supplying the gender and the age and everything with my own ear and transposed it. So I never had one thought that one person was speaking.
Okay,
And that, you know, that may happen to a lot of people. This,
right.
Yeah, I've had that experience.
Uh-huh.
You wonder how one person can do all the voices. And I think part of it is in your head.
Mhm.
But it would be, the racial component would be critically important for me to get across to people. And
Well, you
I
might
don't
be
know
the
how a
second.
white reader could do that, quite honestly. So, I don't know. I'll think about it and talk to people. Try to come up with a solution, try to come up with the money.
So if you could distill it into a mission, what was your mission in doing it?
I can't hear you, sorry.
I said, if you could distill it into a mission, what would be the mission in writing the book?
My mission. That has changed over the past couple of years. My initial mission was, I wrote the book for myself initially, and I think it's probably safe to say that most people who write autobiographies or memoirs initially write for themselves because it's such a personal experience to put your life story onto paper. And then that started changing as people read the book and responded to the book. And I realized that my mission had changed to one of really wanting to inspire dialogue and conversation in this country in ways that we have been terribly remiss at doing. And that's what's happening. And that's why I love doing these readings, because people ask really important questions and offer their personal reflections. And I find that really important, especially in the political climate we're in at this point.
So I was at the Central High Reunion last night, and we were looking at old yearbooks, and here's, you know, the 1968 yearbook, and there's no mention of Martin Luther King being assassinated. None. And it's just like, oh my goodness. You know, if I graduated in '70, but if there was anything I remember about those years, it was that assassination, right? I mean, you know, there were other, of course, my classmates and all that, but in terms of impact, so it's just interesting how it was just ignored.
How would you see that being represented in a high school yearbook?
You could say this happened, and as a result, X happened. You know, I mean, so it affected our interactions with each other. I mean, Stax Records was 6 blocks away, and Steve Cropper could no longer play with the Black guys, right? Because it was too scary. It happened. It happened to us, right? I mean, there was a time in which there was greater integration. And then when that happened, it just cut through. I'm just saying, I think you could have one page on it.
Yeah, or a tribute or something, yeah.
Right, I mean,
Right.
just something that said, this happened.
Right, in these children's lives.
And instead of
At
just,
that
oh,
time.
this is another yearbook, just like it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I have lived away since 72. I've lived away in Austin, Texas. And no one could understand how that affected me. So, anyway, I'm just saying there's something that's unique to have been coming of age at that time.
Yeah. Well, I should point out that I used the term desegregation throughout the book intentionally, and if I used the word integration, it was intentional for another purpose. But our schools were desegregated.
Right.
Our schools were really not integrated because integration implies a social interaction, and for the most part, outside of school, that just simply was not happening.
That's good. That's good.
So that's why I used desegregation throughout the book.
That's good.
I remember Robert Wallace going to Ivy Labs. We were in the 4th grade. And I thought, this is wonderful. You know, finally, we're seeing what it's really like in Memphis and elsewhere in the world, but no one was acknowledging publicly for the most part.
Who was it that came?
Robert Moss. And then I went to Fairview with him and a number of other rascals, while Shelley and Dwayne and others were at Bellevue, and then ended up in Central. I didn't want to go to Bellevue because of my older sister. And then I thought all the stops and rich kids went to Snowden, so I said, I'll go to Fairview with the thugs. Pretty much that's what was there.
Well, there was another component to the little social integration that was happening. A lot of you know who Jimmy Fox is. He went to Bellevue, did not go to Central. He was there last night. And Jimmy and Dwayne were best friends, best inseparable friends. They played every sport together. Jimmy's white, Dwayne's black. They were inseparable. They slept at each other's houses, and you know, we knew. Everybody knew it, and it was okay because they were guys. You know, they were athletes doing their thing. And when Dwayne and I started dating, Jimmy's girlfriend was my best friend. And she could not tolerate, she could tolerate Jimmy and Dwayne. She could not tolerate Dwayne and Shelley. And it was the dating aspect, it was that elephant in the room, especially in the South, about interracial couples, you know, what that might lead to, and you know, oh my God, what are they doing with each other, crossing the lines, yeah, she couldn't make that transition, so it's the end of that friendship. Pretty interesting to me that those two things happen in parallel.
So how long have you been invited together?
Not very long, because when we started going out, sort of at the beginning of the 8th grade, and then that following, still in the 8th grade, the following April is when Dr. King was killed. And that event in Memphis changed everything. You know, Dwayne, I didn't even have the opportunity to make a decision about whether or not I could continue seeing him in the ripples of what was happening, but he absolutely could not continue seeing me. And
You made you realize that
he couldn't, I'm trying to think how he's actually explained it to me. He couldn't justify dating a white girl in the wake of that terrible assassination. That, you know, his family was so personally involved in that, and he was so deeply affected by it, and he felt like he needed to focus on his community. So we broke up, and but then over the years we've been back in touch with each other, and we're very close today. So yeah, we probably dated for less than a year.
That was a long time.
Do you see or have any hope for your book having any way to speak to our grandchildren's generation?
Well, I have hope of the book being used in schools, and I'm in conversation with some high schools about that. Are you talking about our grandchildren?
Specifically, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
But you know, in the broader context of
young people.
how old they are,
Yeah.
and even their parents, our children.
Yeah. Well, your children have read my book. My children have not read my book, which I find.
I gave your book to my daughter. I said, I've been always telling them about our story, and when Shelley wrote it, of course, it was a lot more complicated with you, what I went through, but anyway, the whole story of growing up in the desegregation, which I went through again when I lived in Cleveland.
Mhm.
I'm like, we did this in the 70s, and you're just now starting desegregation in the 80s. I was like, I went through all that again, but I gave it to her. She was, Mom, I can't believe that your school and the city and all this stuff went through that. So I love your book because I've handed it to some friends, which you helped me with, and it just was. There's nothing else like it, really. I think it describes what we were going through. So I loved it. So.
Well, I actually have, like I said, I don't think my sons have even read the book, and I don't know why. I try not to bug them about it. I'm sure my grandchildren have not read the book, although they're mentioned in it and they're pictured in it. So I don't know about it on a personal level, but I only have hope for young people in this country, pretty much. That's where my hope lies for any real progress and getting beyond a lot of what we grew up with. So what I have all kinds of fantasies about this story. I've never read a story like this in my reading world, and I think it would make a fabulous ballet. I think a ballet could be created out of a snippet of this book that would be really powerful. And Stephanie, who's the stepmother of Robin Harlow, this is Stephanie, and I have talked about this ballet, and she took me to a performance. It was a fundraising luncheon of the new ensemble ballet here, which her good friend directs, and an absolutely stunning African-American male dancer danced with an equally stunning white woman dancer. And first of all, I was like, wow, I mean, it's so hard. I still have to work at that this can happen because it was so not even in the realm of possibility when I was their age. So it's still a new experience for me, and it was a powerful dance. It really moved me, and it made me think that, wow, this could be an interesting ballet.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
We'll have to
And
discuss it.
so ballet, indie film, and stage play are my thoughts about how to go forward with this book. Why not dream big? I mean, I never thought I'd do this, so
How do you see it?
what the heck?
How do you see it being taught in school?
Hmm?
How do you see it being taught in school?
Well, just as an example, the old Sears building, the Crosstown Concourse, has a high school in it. And I took the book to one of the English teachers at that school a couple of months ago. And she wants to interface with a history teacher in that high school and teach the book together from their different vantage points, and then do day trips through Memphis to the landmarks that are mentioned in the book, and so that the kids can learn the history and see the history. Probably most of those kids have never been to the Civil Rights Museum, for instance, or been to Mason Temple, or been to City Hall, or any of the places that are mentioned. So that's one possibility that I'm in conversation about.
Because our history classes went up till maybe World War II.
Yeah.
We never had anything more recent. We never got further than that. We start Middle Ages and then whatever. We never got past World War II, and I always wished we did a little further. I'm interested because the people I know here, we grew up in Memphis, but we've all left. I wonder if people who have stayed here, if they have, some of the same feelings of ownership of this place, and how things have changed, and how that has changed our lives, you know, and I can't speak to that because I don't know. But anyway, I'm curious what others say.
I mean, it's a totally different experience because I know so many of our classmates who have never lived anyplace else,
Right, but
ever.
there were a lot last night.
So,
Uh,
I don't know, I would assume there's some degree of appreciation and some degree of jaded. You know, you just get used to a place, you take things for granted, and I know my level of appreciation, having been away for so long, is pretty extraordinary. I love this city. This is what I say when people ask me how I feel about Memphis. I say Memphis brings me joy every day and breaks my heart every day. And that pretty much encapsulates how I feel about the city. There's so much good going on, and there's so much heartache and heartbreak and desperation. So I was at a campaign event recently, and somebody said, "Well, who would you support in the next mayoral race?" And I said, "No mayoral candidate is going to get my support unless he or she head-on faces the reality and the problems associated with the poverty in this city. Because this city cannot move forward without addressing the fact that 25% of its population lives in abject poverty. It's, you know, it just can't, it's not gonna happen. So, you know, I have obviously pretty strong feelings about the subject, but
But that 25% needs to be educated so that they can actually do jobs that exist today.
Right.
We have to face that.
right. And, you know, let's not beat around the bush. The majority of that minority is African American who live in poverty. You know, the black schools in this city are not up to par. They're not up to par in terms of facilities, books, educators, school grounds, buildings. I mean, how many times have we read about mold, roaches, and rats in Memphis City schools today? That's inexcusable. In a city that's building gorgeous high-rise hotels at the end of Beale Street, okay, well that's fine, but not in place of dealing with your citizens. Deal with your citizens and start with the youngest of them, because that's where change is going to happen. So that's what breaks my heart about the city, because I just feel like there's not a real proactive, there's not proactive attention given to that population. There are a lot of Band-Aids.
That should have been learned from what you encapsulated.
Yeah.
That have not, these 50 years later plus, been put into action.
Well, speaking of educators, I remember when we moved to Central, in that first year, there was no desegregation really, and then it started the next year. And you remember all the teachers that left?
Yep.
There were quite teachers that just like walked out the door because they were like, I'm not, because Central was considered one of the better high schools in Memphis. And they said, I'm not dealing with this, and they just didn't come back.
Right.
So a lot of us, like me, I got a different homeroom teacher. We all got shuffled up again and everything and stuff. And one thing I'll say, there were a lot of blacks that were not happy to be in that school because their whole lives were uprooted, and they were like on the football team or a cheerleader. They were in these clubs and that clubs, and they got forced into this school with leaving all their friends. And I just kept thinking, like, let's give them. I mean, part of the problem is they're not having good teachers. Then we supposed to have good teachers, and all these teachers left because they were afraid. It was really frustrating.
I know, it's complicated
Yeah.
because there's no question that the schools should have been brought up to standard.
Exactly.
And that was
Those schools go down.
The basis for so much of the desegregation plan is that, you know, a lot of schools sucked.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's one issue, but there's the other issue of, can we really exist in this world if we never have any interaction with other cultures and other races and other nationalities. I mean that, you know, so in the purest form, I'm a deep believer in integration, but not in terms of bringing people of color into the white world as a fix.
Didn't work.
And that's what it was.
It didn't
That's what
work.
it was.
And someone was having in Cleveland, I'm thinking, we tried this in Memphis and it didn't work. I mean, are they not paying attention? There's ways to do it where you, and Memphis the thing was different because there was Cuyahoga River and all the whites were on this side and all the black folks were on this side and they wanted to move the kids back and forth over buses, over bridge in the winter and stuff. I'm like, this is like dangerous kind of stuff.
Not well thought through.
No.
Right.
So,
Yeah, it's interesting. Our mom, nobody met this head on. Administrators, teachers, parents, nobody met the desegregation effort head on in Memphis. Nobody. And so my mom joined a group of parents who were meeting, who tried to meet at St. John's Methodist at Bellevue and Peabody, because she knew the minister there. And Mindy McWilliams' mom was involved, and several other classmates' parents were involved. And the parents got together because they wanted to talk about what their children were facing. This was a brand new day, and it was a very interracial group, and they were really just trying to be supportive of each other and help guide their kids through this experience. And the church kicked them out because they were an interracial group of parents trying to make a difference and trying to not just make a difference, but trying to deal with reality. Like, let's just deal with reality here. This is happening. We need to talk about it. Our children are struggling. Anyway, that was the end of that. At that time, there were very few places where black and white groups could gather. Very few places in the city of Memphis. I know, church. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. I appreciate all of you.
thank you for writing the book.